Hey, Gwilym, I've got a bit of a puzzle for you.
Go.
So we're in the year 2035, and you are in a series of tests against the very best AI-based robot on the planet. I don't know why humanity's picked you, but it has. You've lost every test so far, but the last one is winner takes all. It's a hunting test. Now, dozens of animals are set loose, and the fastest to capture them all wins. You lose. You ask for a rematch, and you win. The AI asks for a rematch. You win. The audience asks for a rematch. You win. Why?
The audience. Is this like the Hunger Games, but with
Yeah.
animals? What
So
kind of
every
animal?
rematch, you win. Why do you win?
Can I get some details first?
No, don't be a patent attorney. Just answer the puzzle.
Just quickly, what are the animals? That might be relevant. It might be relevant what the animals are. What are the animals?
Kind of mildly wild.
You spring this on me. I'm springing a couple of questions back on you.
I think
I'm
rabbit's
going to
hair. I
go
don't know, that sort of thing.
rabbit's hair. Good.
You're overthinking it, though.
Do I need to know the difference between them?
No.
Okay. And what's the last question before I answer your puzzle?
Yeah.
What is the AI called? That seems to be really relevant.
Norman.
I think it's because the audience has a vote and they just thought that's the worst AI name ever and disabled it. That's my guess.
No.
Go on.
Yeah. Well, we all know robots can't recapture. Boom, boom.
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the two IPs in the pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
It could be one IP if this continues.
Yeah, sorry about that, mate. That wasn't. It was the best I could come up with. I've been sat here scrabbling around for a decent AI joke that I could use to kick the show off, and
You
that was
failed.
the best I could come up with.
Okay.
What have you been up to, mate?
Well, beautiful sunny day. I went for a walk in the park and had a cup of tea. And as we've discussed many times before, these little pleasures are wonderful things, frankly, at the moment. I was actually reflecting mostly on this is, of course, our 1000th podcast, Lee. So it's a big one for us.
Things like that.
And when we start, all right, maybe not the 1000th, but when we started, how nervous I was about the things around me and the noises that were happening in the background. I remember in one of the very early ones, I told all my kids that I was going to do a podcast, but that didn't stop one of my sons coming in and blowing his nose into the sink.
That's right. Yeah, I remember it well.
Yeah, I remember that. No tissues, straight to the. He didn't really do that either. I didn't quite know. He thought, "Oh, it's a podcast day. Let's blow it straight to the sink." I don't care now, and you can. I think everyone's just got so used to these things that you could have people running around doing kung fu behind you, and it all just continue. So it's funny how things have moved on. That's my reflection. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm all right. I've been doing a fair bit of walking. I've got fed up with running, so I'm just doing as much walking as I can. And you might not know, but you remember from like things like Super Congress, I'm a big stick fan. I like walking sticks and all-night walking sticks. Because I've been walking quite late at night, I've put a front headlight on my walking stick and a rear red light as well. So when I'm walking down lanes and it's quite dark, I can put my lights on and I look like a bike going down the lane. It's brilliant. Absolutely. I don't go that fast, obviously, but yeah, it's cool.
Have you invested in the horn as well? So you can beat people walking towards
let's keep my
you?
horn out of this, shall we?
Okay. This time.
Anyway, great podcast today. We've got three folk from IBM with us to talk all things AI, which is one we've been wanting to do for a long time. I'm going to ask our guests to introduce themselves, but very briefly, we've got Rashik Parmar, we've got Manny Schecter, and Anita Shaw. So, Rashik, do you fancy introducing yourself first? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah. I'm Rashik Parmar. I'm IBM's CTO for EMEA.
What's that?
I just do things techie, that's all.
Manny, how about you?
Hi, I'm Manny Schecter. I am a longtime IBMer and am the Chief Patent Counsel at IBM corporate headquarters. I'm speaking to you today from my home in the U.S. in Connecticut, which is kind of a winter wonderland right now.
And last but not least, by any means, Anita, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Anita Shaw. I'm a dual qualified UK and European patent attorney. And I have a number of roles. They do complement each other, which is good. So I work in cloud and AI on strategy, policy, and I love all things tech as well. So that was my first love.
It was why we came to you straight up. When we thought we need to do an AI podcast, there was only one person we could come to. And
I have a better name for a robot, by the way.
What?
It's got to be Watson, hasn't it?
It's elementary, of course. Sorry, just get a little Sherlock Holmes joke in quickly.
I've got to stop laughing at these jokes because, as you can see, it encourages
I have got a Sherlock
him.
Holmes joke, but now probably isn't the time to do it, is it? So let's crack on. I thought we'd start off with a really simple question. What is AI? Who fancies that one?
So I guess as the techie, and I didn't really introduce myself. So I'm 37 years in IBM, worked on all kinds of technology things, and happened to also have 4 Nobel Prize winners in the team working with me. So it's quite a challenge. So when we think about AI, everybody thinks about artificial intelligence. It's not something that's new, right? We've been working on artificial intelligence since 1965. And to really sort of unpack that, if you think how fast technology's moved, right? So technology in the form of IT starts in 1947 with the invention of a transistor. Bell Labs in New Jersey, they created this transistor, a nice piece of gold. You can actually go see it if you go to the museum over there. And it progresses very, very fast, through to the point where in 2010, we have 1 billion transistors to every human alive. So that's a kind of pace of change of technology, right? 2016, we start to have manufacturing more transistors than we manufacture grains of rice. So just to kind of put it in perspective, and if you think about a typical kind of new smartphone today, that's going to have over 1 billion transistors in there.
In one phone?
In one phone, yeah. So just to kind of get your mindset in terms of how much technology sits in there. And what that does is it really just does calculations very fast. That's not artificial intelligence, right? So to be able to do artificial intelligence, what we've been trying to do since early 1965 is to understand how does a human brain work and try and mimic that in different ways. And there's been different forms of ways of doing that. And what's really happened over, I would say, the last 4 or 5 years is that there's a combination of 2 sets of techniques of how we start to understand the human brain, right? One is to mirror the brain and create human brain type structures, so like the neurons and synapses and so on. And then the other thing is to use probabilistic models, because through all those transistors, one of the things you get is lots of data. So what we have today is roughly 40 exabytes of data. So exabyte is 10 to the 23. So 23 zeros on the end. That's the amount of data. And we kind of double the amount of data every 18 months. And so what we're trying to use artificial intelligence to do is to abstract those data into models, which can help us predict what might happen in the future. Right? And a best example of understanding that is if you think about what we saw in 2012 with Watson, right? So the Watson game playing engine, which played Jeopardy. You had 2 individuals, Ken and Brad, who'd spent their life understanding how to answer these Jeopardy questions. And we had this computer system, which was a small computer called Watson, trying to answer the same kind of questions, right? And the Watson system won. So it actually played against them, and it was getting the data in the same way. And there were all the kind of rules put in place, which was he couldn't press the buzzer less than 100 milliseconds because that's how long it takes a brain to send a message to the thumb. So we're trying to be fair. And so artificial intelligence is basically our way of trying to mimic the way the brain works and create automations or tools that augment what humans do. And that's really all it's about.
That made absolute sense to me, and I'm the innocent bystander in all of this. So if I get it anyway. I'll ask a quick question. It's not necessarily related to AI, but I remember reading back in maybe 2010, 2011, and I used to use it in presentations that I was doing in sort of association work then, that a human then, so me at that age, mid-40s, as I was then, I would be exposed to more data in one day of my life than my grandparents would have been exposed to in their lifetime. Was that reasonable?
It's absolutely reasonable. And what we're seeing now is that we no longer worry about learning. We worry about just-in-time skills acquisition, right? Because the amount of learning that you can do is limited by the time you have, whereas being able to acquire the skills just as you need it is much more viable now.
Manny, Anita, do either of you want to come in on what is AI?
I'll just say one thing here, Lee. I forget how you put the original question, but it was something like, what is AI, or what is the definition of AI? And I would simply say there is no single generally accepted definition of artificial intelligence, to my knowledge. I think Rashik would probably agree.
There was quite a move to actually avoid the term AI altogether, wasn't there? I think the purists much prefer machine learning, but I guess it's just caught on.
I think most people think of machine learning as a subset of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and it may be worth just explaining two different things here. One is machine learning and one's deep learning. So you'll hear both of these two terms. And machine learning is saying, how do we use the data to abstract the pieces of knowledge that we can see from that through probabilistic models that we built? So layers and layers of probabilistic models. And there's two forms of this. One is what we call symbolic, which is, I know, for example, an apple grows on a tree. It can be red. It's round. It has seeds. So there's characteristics, and we could define intelligence in the form of symbols and building those things. The other form of artificial intelligence comes from building the learning, which says, from this data, I know when this happens and this happens, this is what is there. So I can build a model to abstract out the dots of a screen and say those dots represent a character 0 or a character 1. And deep learning models go down to multiple levels. The more levels you have, the deeper the learning is, and the more you can predict from that.
Should we move on to the kinds of things that IBM's involved in at the moment, the sort of projects that you've got on? But before we do that, let me just ask one more question, because Gwilym knows that this fascinates me. How important was it when Deep Blue beat Kasparov in '97? Because that's kind of one of my permanent memories is of that happening.
I think it's an important point in history because nobody ever expected a computer system to be able to beat a grandmaster, because there are so many combinations of permutation. I forget the actual numbers, but the fact that a computer system could beat Kasparov, it was kind of showing that computers had come of age and they could do things which humans thought they would never be able to do. So it was a really important point. I think the other seminal point we'll go back to is when Watson played Jeopardy and won. I think there's another seminal point as well, which is, when AlphaGo played against itself to learn how to play Go. Right? So by just giving a piece of code the knowledge of how to play the game, it was playing against itself and learn how to play better and better. No humans involved. Right? And so those are a really fascinating kind of evolutions of where the technology has progressed.
The reason the chess thing fascinates me is because I think it tells us stories about how the future might look in terms of cooperation between human and machine. Because, of course, Kasparov was massively deflated, wasn't he? But he went away and he created hybrid chess.
Yep.
So you've got machine against human, machine against machine, and machine against a mixture of human and machine. And the fascinating thing for me in all of that is it's the human machine combination that tends to win more often, and that tells me something about that the future is some kind of, I use the word centaur, some sort of like blend of machine and person. Anyway, I'll get off of that. That's just a little pet subject.
But Lee, before we get off that, so one thing that we might want to think about is, when you project out in the future, and I look at the story My Fair Lady, could we see a point in the future where you can take somebody who's a novice and use a tool, an artificial intelligence tool, to make them a grandmaster and play against a grandmaster and win, right? How far are we away from doing that? And actually, that's one of the research challenges that we've set some of our colleagues. So those are some of the things that we're still working on, right? So
that fascinates me in terms of the work. So I have this thing about the world of work and thinking about what the world of work might look like. And what I'm hearing is that the future professional might not need to go through this extended learning and developing of sort of not necessarily skills, but knowledge, because we might better take someone who's a relative novice and turn them into a patent attorney with the aid of a machine. How cool would that be, Gwilym? A robot Roberts.
What do I think? I think I'm going to listen a bit more to what IBM has to say before I start expressing my feelings and views, because there's lots yet to learn, I think.
Anita, you've not spoken to us yet. Come on, tell us something about what IBM's up to.
So one thing about being in-house is that I get to work with people like Rashik. So I would definitely say to you attorneys out there, stay close to your clients. I think the discussion about definitions is interesting. It's such a base concept. Surely we know what AI means. But the fact that the technical community is still thrashing that out, with organizations such as ISO, I think one of my messages today is to really ensure that we in the legal and IP communities stay close to our clients and not rush ahead. I think, law tends to trail technology. That's a natural thing. We don't want to get ahead of it, right? So go slow is my message.
Can I just come back on something on there? Because the way I heard you describing the internal relationship in IBM is that you see your inventives and creatives as very much your clients. So you've got a client relationship within the company.
It's true. I do have some clients who are friends who hate that term. Stop calling me your client. We're actually all on the same side of the fence, which I think being in-house, again, is that privilege and insight to get a view into offerings, services, our research arm. We have a very prestigious and well-known research community and an early insight as well. So I think, again, as in-house attorneys, when it comes to policy and strategy, it's very much, working side by side with our clients, other functions such as government and regulatory affairs, general legal. Within IBM as IP, we never work in a bubble. I think that's a huge advantage to give that bird's eye view of what's going on in a complex space such as AI.
Let's talk a little bit about IBM then. What's on the radar? What projects are big at the moment? And particularly in terms of AI, what's the sort of short to long-term strategy?
So let me take that one and I'll kind of unpack it into different areas. Okay, so one of my favorite topics is, can we use AI to understand people? And the answer is, well, we can do a lot. So if we take about 300 of your words from social media, I can use that using a piece of tooling called Personality Insights that will help build the psychometric profile for you, just as if you'd taken a 2-hour psychometric profile test. And that's fascinating because you can use that in many ways, right? And the field of research then is progressing to, can we use those kind of technologies to help predict early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia or other mental disease, right? And yes, we can, right? We can also use that same kind of technology to help autistic children. So in the learning process, we can use this to build robots who can mimic the emotions. An autistic child struggles to cope with emotions, right? And so using those kind of technologies, we can help create the facial expression for particular emotions and help teach children. So that's one thread that's going on. The other thread that's obviously very, very key is intelligent workflows, right? So when you think about activities that people perform, we've been automating process in different ways and creating online tools that automate well-established process. But that's very mechanical. It doesn't really cope with many of the conditions and problems. So the combination of being able to abstract out knowledge from textual input, unstructured text, that along with more and more ability to make more complex decisions using a wider range of data sources allows us to get more and more intelligent workflows. And you see that in many different places, right? Then you look at voice and speech recognition and speech-based systems. We'll all be familiar with things like the various assistants, the Amazon Echoes and those kind of things. That goes back to research that we did back in the early 60s when we're looking at voice recognition. And that, again, has progressed at a phenomenal pace. So you take voice recognition with natural language understanding that we now have from the range of things, you can start to provide very powerful conversations. So just 18 months ago, we had Watson Debater, where Watson was asked to debate a question of, should schooling be provided free for young children? And what's the value of that? And have a debate as you would in a university or in a debating society. And we had the leader from Oxford, the recognized debating expert with Watson having that debate and providing rebuttal. And in there, you saw things like humor, you saw sarcasm. So all those kind of things that we wouldn't think of as a computer being able to mimic was actually shown as part of that structure. And then you see a range of tools and techniques. So one of my favorite projects is a project to mirror what Gaudi does as part of his sculpture and to use his work to create a tool that would allow us to build a sculpture as Gaudi would have done. And it was actually in the Mobile World Congress in 2018. There was a moving sculpture, which was very Gaudi-esque, right? Or there's things that we've done with, for example, with Bollywood, where we've provided the fashion designers tools to go and look at the range of fashion and structure that people have and use that as a way of predicting future fashion based on the images that are out there.
You wouldn't be able to do that with me.
Well, that's a challenge. Maybe we should take that challenge up.
You need to tell him about your shoe collection, Lee.
Oh, yeah, no, to be fair, I've got a reasonable shoe collection. This is true.
I was going to pick up actually on the other bit that Lee mentioned there, which fascinates me, which was that question about, I think you said short to medium term strategy. I'm interested in IBM's long-term strategy in relation to AI. You're a pretty well-established company now. You're the company that's got visions and values and strategies probably coming out your ears. What is it for AI? Where do you want to go? Where is it taking you? Where are you taking it?
Well, so I think it's not just AI. We think of the future of computing in three broad contexts, right? One is traditional, what we call von Neumann systems, or future of bits. There's a future of neurons, which is a kind of AI piece, and there's a future of quantum. So let me try and kind of unpack that. We will continue to see faster and smaller transistors. Now that's going to happen, and it's going to continue to happen. We're down at 7 nanometer right now. We can see 5 nanometer, we can see 3 nanometer. So that's the kind of size of a particular transistor. And so you can see that continuing to double over the 18, 24-month period. Future of neurons is really saying, how do we augment what humans do and augment all parts of our senses? So augmenting hearing, augmenting taste, smell, sight, right, in different ways, and thinking of each of those as new ways of interacting with those. And it's really focused on trying to remove the uncertainty in daily life. If you think about where uncertainty exists, by bringing new data into that space, you can start to solve all kinds of problems, right? And I'll give you a really simple way of thinking of this, right? If you think about what happened when you were asking for a taxi 10 years ago, you'd phone a taxi company and say, I want a taxi to go from my house to the train station. And the taxi company would come back and say, the person at the other end would say, the taxi's going to come in 10 minutes. You knew at best that was a guess, at worst it was a lie, but you didn't know where in between those two things was, right? What did Uber do when they came along? Uber said, we will give you a digital representation of that taxi on a map. We'll take all the data and tell you how much and what the traffic pattern is, and we'll tell you that taxi is going to arrive in 9 minutes. And that gave you a level of certainty that you didn't have before. And so you really take things that are friction or uncertainty and move that forward. That takes you so far, but then you say, well, okay, how can I really predict things? And that's where quantum comes in, right? So quantum computers, very different from traditional computers. And quantum is all about really thinking through problems in very different ways. So if I take a very simple thing like a caffeine molecule and say, I want to be able to model every single electron state for that caffeine molecule. And I started today on the largest supercomputer in Los Alamos. It would take something like 44 nonillion years to do that calculation based on today's computers, because there are just so many states. And that's only a few molecules. It's not very complex molecules. That's 260 electrons, if I remember rightly. If I was to do that on a quantum system, if I took a 260 qubit system, I would be able to model every single state of that caffeine molecule in a matter of a second or so. Depends on the power. And so I can start to do discovery around molecules, around optimization of process in ways that I can't imagine today using AI. So it's a combination of those three. And so we see AI and quantum and the future of computing really addressing some of the systemic issues that exist in the world today. That's basically it.
Cool, thank you. That's what's reassuring. First of all, thank you, IBM. And because I think, as you said, these three amazing areas all need to be brought together. I was wondering actually if we can, because this is an IP-oriented position, carrying on with strategy, but on the IP front, Manny, I don't know if you've got kind of commentary about where AI fits within your kind of IP strategy.
Well, of course, because artificial intelligence is of strategic importance to IBM, that means it's a particular focus area of our intellectual property team. We certainly, because of that desire to maintain a large and strong portfolio of intellectual property related to artificial intelligence, I think most folks that have attempted to review artificial intelligence patent portfolios size ours as among the largest and strongest, if not the very largest and very strongest, which is, of course, the way we think of it. The hardest part for us really is I think what it is for you and for all of us, based on the questions you just asked Rashik, which is keeping up with the technology. It's moving very quickly, and it's very important to us to continue to obtain intellectual property that is most relevant to the direction of the business. And as the technology moves faster, it tends to zig and zag a bit faster. And just as taxi technology, as Rashik just mentioned, has changed dramatically over the years, you could imagine that intellectual property attorneys who support taxi companies and Uber would have had to change their direction quite a bit. The same is really true for us, but the same basic principles underneath continue, and we rely on them. So, for example, when Rashik's team wants to collaborate with another party, our patents help facilitate that because they ensure that we have protection for the work that we've already done, and yet at the same time enable us to set up a framework where two or multiple parties can work together.
Yeah, and as I said, don't worry, you've got a pretty pro IP team talking to you today, so we're very comfortable with that use of it. Are we going to? Oh, well, that's a controversial question. If you don't want to answer it, we could just cut it out. But are we going to see kind of an AI portfolio battle going between some of the big players here? Is that happening already? Are we seeing stockpiling of IP in this area? Obviously, there's lots of room for collaboration, but there's also a kind of a commercial position to protect as well.
Well, I think every time there's an area of technology that starts to take off, we see a sort of gold rush mentality to acquire intellectual property in that space. Are we going to have the kind of race, so to speak, that you mentioned? That's hard to say. You'd have to ask the other participants in this space. We certainly know from some of the articles that we've read that we're not the only ones actively pursuing intellectual property in this space, but our mission isn't necessarily just to have a race against the other competitors. It's to build a portfolio that is strong enough to ensure IBM's freedom of action, that is our ability to develop and market the products and services that we see fit without interference from third parties, and to help generate a return on our investment in research and development.
I mean, to be honest with you, that seems like a perfectly appropriate and common use of IP. It's very reassuring against the context of your strategy and goals. You know, the reasons you're going down this route are for the common good, and the IP side of it then makes perfect sense. But it's fascinating to watch, and it's interesting. Yeah, we've seen this history before with what you might call a platform technology. You do have to have that early stage, and everyone's rushing to develop. I think it'd be interesting to see how it pans out. Having seen what happened in telecoms, I'm sure you look at other areas and how things have developed there. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out on the patent front over the years to come.
I think there's an interesting twist on the whole IP space here, because often the machine learning type AI systems are a combination of not just the IP itself, but also the data that you provided to it. And so data ownership and data assets, as well as the artificial intelligence assets, they kind of go together. And so I think that's also challenging us and helping us kind of think through what should be the thing that's protected. And one of the challenges I always give to my teams is, are we using intellectual property rights to protect our rights, or are we impeding progress? And we really need to think carefully about that when we do look at this, because a lot of our work now is open source. And so that creates a very different set of challenges where we've got to think through these things.
I want to bring in the patent system in a moment and maybe get Anita to speak a little bit about that. But before I do, can I just, right at the very start of your piece earlier, Rashik, you talked about something that was relevant to a conversation that we were having when we were planning this podcast. We were looking at some news that was coming out, I think it was of the States, of discussions that were happening around, I think it was algorithms, I might get the technology wrong, that were in the process of being patented. And what they would do, they would be able to sort of like harvest your social media identity and potentially keep you going beyond the grave. So, your Twitter ID, your Facebook ID could just carry on as if it were you beyond the grave. Where does ethics sit in all of this?
Yeah, so ethics is a massive, massive topic for us. I have a number of people on the team focused very much on ethics, privacy, individual rights, and how we process. So we actually have a code of conduct that we work within. We start to look at topics like the overall ethical structure of how we do that. I mean, we could almost have a full podcast talking about this.
Yeah.
What I always say to the team is, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So think about the impact of what that does, and is it really helping drive progressive society in the way that we want to be part of, or not? And you need to think about that from a human perspective. Now, obviously, you can't stop everybody doing what they're doing, right? So within the IBM company, we can still do some things, and our legal structure helps us do that, and the employment structure, and the kind of business conduct guidelines and things that people adhere to, the professionals we have. But then you look at the perpetrators and how perpetrators can use artificial intelligence to do all kinds of things that you wouldn't want them to do. Right? Mm-hmm. And so it is always a constant race between the perpetrators and those that are trying to use these technologies for good. Right? And how we balance that it's a big societal challenge which we're still grappling with.
Right, yeah, extraordinary. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it on that level, to be honest. Anita, can we switch? You might be the right person to pick up on this, or it might be for Manny and Rashik to come in as well. The patent system, how fit for purpose is it in terms of the sorts of things that IBM is doing around AI and other disruptive technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing with AI, it's really sparked interesting conversations across the board. I mean, we've talked about the technology and the broader legal fields. Especially in the EU, there's a lot of initiatives around ethics, bias, trust, transparency, liability. And so just a flag really to IP practitioners that this is a much broader debate. And it's a joy really working in a company like IBM, because as an IP practitioners, I get to see a little bit of what's going on at that broader level. In terms of patents, Gwilym, you probably see as a UK and EU IP practitioner, the amount that's happening in the policy space. And I think we have to mention DABUS and inventorship and ownership by AI, discussions that were really happening before those applications were filed, but certainly fast forwarded because the IP offices worldwide, a number of them now have these live applications. That's resulted in a lot of public consultations issued by worldwide offices. IBM is actively involved in responding to those. So, for example, in front of the USPTO, WIPO, and more recently for the UK IPO and its call for views. And so I have a number of messages I can share on that topic. One, picking up on some of what Rashik is saying with IBM seeing AI as very human-centric, a tool that's used to assist humans and augment human intelligence. With that in mind, we believe that autonomously generated inventions, generalized AI, is some way off. As an applicant as well, with a worldwide global portfolio, actually the fact that we're having these debates slightly early on, slightly before the technology is matured, is a positive thing, because hopefully that means, with stakeholder debate, we're able to form some sort of harmonization at an international level. Again, I would say to the UK folks, try to track what's happening there on a global level, and particularly what's happening in Europe. I mean, our base position, Lee, is that talking to our technologists, strategists, and also as an IP and legal team, we're not seeing any immediate need for changes on the inventorship, ownership issues right now in terms of current patent laws. That's not to say we're not averse to changes, but right now we don't see that immediate need. I mean, bringing this back to the UK and the DABUS applications, I believe that's going to continue going through the courts. So I think they're heading to the Court of Appeals. So again, in the UK, we absolutely need to track that. I see even more of a need to actually slow down and watch and listen, given that we could have a live appeal on our hands very soon.
Sometimes I hear people, particularly those outside the patent system that don't believe in the patent system, express that the fact that we have DABUS or some of the other difficult points that are under consideration by the authorities around the world with respect to how to cope with artificial intelligence in the intellectual property world, I hear them use that as, or attempt to use that as evidence that something must be wrong with the system, that the fact that the system is ironing out or attempting to iron out details about how to cope must be some sort of evidence that the system is failing. And I just like to say, I think the opposite is true. The fact of the matter is that, the patent system is designed, its intent is to work by definition, which we all know this, which with things that are new, right? They're innovations. They're not things that we could easily anticipate coming down the pike. If we could, they wouldn't be inventions, right? They wouldn't be patentable at all. But the point is, therefore, that the law is always going to lag the technology some. The fact that artificial intelligence is starting to move rather quickly in development, though it has a long ways to go, means that it's not surprising that the patent system and other aspects that authorities consider are only now starting to try to come to grips with some of the nuances of these technologies. It's not surprising that, law that was written decades ago wouldn't have anticipated some of these issues. And the fact that we're now having lots of discussions about them is actually evidence that, the right thing is happening, that the governments are trying to figure out how to cope with the new technology. We talked earlier about the fact that, there is no single accepted definition of artificial intelligence. And one of the things that, at a very fundamental level, which continues to concern me, is that as the authorities review artificial intelligence and mull what, if any, changes they need to make to accommodate artificial intelligence, is that they don't all speak about the same thing. That is, they use slightly different terminology, slightly different definitions of artificial intelligence. And if they rush too quickly to change their laws, to change their regulations, to change their processes, they have no idea that they're really acting in very different ways because they're acting on definitions which are not harmonized. So the very first thing that I think all the authorities need to do is to agree on just what aspects of artificial intelligence they're worried about and make sure they're all talking about precisely the same thing.
I agree. I mean, I think the need for harmonization is critical. As soon as one jurisdiction goes off down the path of, say, a non-trivial, quick, non-controversial change to the law, I'm concerned about ripple effects, unintended consequences. They're going to be hard to track back. And given the amount going on at a policy level in the technical and broader legal fields, again, I think that message to slow down is an important one.
I think also it's been interesting how the actual, to go back to Davos for a second, the actual point of law is quite simple. It's not about the patenting of AI. It's not even generally about the patenting by AI. It's purely about naming AI as an inventor, but that's got lost.
I agree, Gwilym. The fact that it was refused in Europe and the UK on a formality gets lost. Actually, in the UK High Court, discussions as to whether Davos even invented weren't raised. So all the big problems, all the big issues are still there to pick through. I would again say, as we start to pick through that, let's stay focused and connected with folks like Rashik. Our technical community, they need to tell us what's happening right. I think that's critical as in the IP and legal fields, policymakers, we have to stay close to our technologists.
Totally agree. And actually, I want to take the opportunity, if I can, to quiz you on this very simple point in a second, Rashik, which is there is some skepticism about whether AI can invent and whether AI genuinely invented the technology underlying those patent applications. Rashik, what is your kind of feeling as a specialist here? Can AI invent? Are we there yet?
Look, I think AI is a very sophisticated way of creating probabilities. Now, if you describe a probability as an invention, then yes. But the reality is we're a long way from when we will have what we refer to as general AI. AI today is very, very specific, based on a very particular set of data, provided in a very specific kind of way, and give you a set of inferences based on that data. There are symbolic structures which let you take definitions of things, and they will give you other different types of answers. The combination may, in the future, do some kind of invention, but it's a may. Nobody's done that yet.
Well, we've got just 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'd like to bring us to a close with a little activity, if that's okay. I have a 17-year-old daughter. She knows that I do this sort of thing. I was talking to her about it last night. We were talking about how different her life as a 17-year-old is from my life as a 17-year-old. Notwithstanding the fact that she's housebound at the moment because of COVID and all that sort of stuff. Clearly, her life is very different for that reason. But she lives in a totally different world. There was no tech around when I was 17, really, other than a CB radio in my mate's car and stuff like that.
You were a punk rocker, Lee. That's what
I was.
you were. I know what you were doing when you were 17.
I was a little bit.
Yeah, I know what you were doing.
Yeah. But she's got technology at her fingertips. And she said, can you ask them to tell me what's going to change in my life next so that I know what's coming? So without giving away any trade secrets, no pending IP or anything like that, perhaps if each of you could just give us a little insight into how the life of a 17-year-old might be just about to change in terms of the future of technology.
So let me take that. And we do actually publish a thing called 5 in 5. So 5 technologies that are going to change your life in 5 years. So, urge readers to go find those. And for me, I think the biggest changes are going to be the ones that are really, really important. So simple things like, can we stop using plastic? Can we do something about the plastic that's out there? Climate change. Can we actually do something to restrict the amount of climate change and the amount of CO2 that we produce? Just ask yourself, how much carbon will we have emitted after we've watched a Netflix movie? Just go Google it. I mean, there is a lot of things that we can do there. And the last piece I think that will change today is we did some analysis a few years back looking at how much wastage there is in the world. There is roughly $4 trillion of waste every year around the world. Right? And I think we will see technologies that will start to reduce that waste and start to address some of the fundamental structural failures that exist in society. And I think that will change rather rapidly now, partly because of COVID, but partly because we have to.
Well, she's going to be delighted when I tell her that, because she's always on about save the penguins, save the seals. It's a big thing in her life. Anita, how about you?
Yeah, well, I can bring this to a personal level. Being one of these parents, trying to homeschool my kids and work and juggle everything else. My kids weren't tech savvy before the pandemic, and now at 8 and 10, they can do everything. It's absolutely amazing. They're getting their songs on there, their books, their films. So it's really infiltrated our lives. Personally, I'm a STEM advocate. So I hope that a positive from this pandemic would be more access to digital tech for our kids, particularly underprivileged kids. And hopefully we'll see a whole new generation of STEM boys and girls. That would be my dream.
That'd be fantastic, wouldn't it? Eh? And Manny, over to you, sir.
I'm afraid I don't have an answer that's going to take things a lot further than Rashik and Anita. As it happens, I have a child who's in his 20s and in graduate school. And sure, I've seen his life growing up to be very different than mine at very fundamental levels. Just for example, from the computer and the internet, meaning he tends to be more of an indoor kid than an outdoor kid, which I was an outdoor kid. I played outside all the time. But, going forward, especially the longer term beyond what Rashik talked about, what I think is most exciting to me is we don't really know. When I think back to when my child was a baby, I couldn't have anticipated what life would be like for him now in graduate school. It's so much different than what I experienced when I was in law school. Yeah. I'm afraid I don't know what it's going to be like for him when he's in his 50s and he's watching his own child grow up. I think that's almost unimaginable.
That's scary, isn't it? That's truly scary. Hey, Gwilym, different question to you, similar vein. What would you like IBM to invent to change your life?
To invent, change my...
what do you want? What do you need, mate? Yeah, here's your chance.
I think AI to do some really useful stuff, like, posting letters. I want AI out there, but I don't want to be taking away the stuff I'm good at. But I want to be doing all my easy stuff that I can't quite get round to, and I want to be able to say to it, "Can you just sort out the house?" That's what I want. There's not much to ask, is it, Lee? Really?
No, I'll come round and sort out your house.
Big thumbs up from Anita. Yeah. Simple stuff. Thank you, Lee. You're very kind.
You're welcome.
What do you want? What do you want from?
Oh, I thought I was going to get away with it.
No, you can't. You've done this to me twice in one blooming podcast. I've got to bounce it back on you.
So I still can't get my head around this blooming bass guitar that I've decided to try and learn how to play. So what I would like is a pair of gloves that would do the fingering for me so I can develop some muscle memory, and then I'd become a master at it. That's what I want. So if you guys are able to do that for me, that's it. You've cracked it. Well, Rashik, Manny, Anita, thank you so much for joining us. It's been thoroughly entertaining, really, really informative, and listeners are going to love it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Yeah.
Take care.
It's been an honor and a pleasure.